It's funny again, for anybody listening, especially younger, I never planned to join aviation. I told myself I would never work for an association.
Okay.
And all these other things I told myself I wouldn't do at the time. And I ended up doing almost everything I told myself I wouldn't do. You just don't, you can plan these things out, but then you get an opportunity that comes along. And, and I also tell people, if you're interested in a job, apply for it. The worst thing you can do is tell you no.
Hello and welcome to the Business Aviation Collective podcast, sponsored by LD Aviation. I'm your host, Lindsay, and today we get a chance to talk to Greg Principato. He has a long and distinguished career in aviation. Back in 2005 to 2013, he was the president of the Airports Council International for North America. He's also been the CEO of the National Aeronautic Association. So welcome, Greg.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I appreciate you taking some time to talk with us.
Sure.
And we kind of talked a little bit before we started recording, but I really, like most of my guests, I'm always interested in knowing, how did you get into aviation?
Well, and again, thank you for inviting me. I saw the list of people you've interviewed before, and it's really a great and varied list. So it's it's wonderful to be included. Yeah, I did not grow up with jet fuel in my bloodstream or any of that. I'm not a pilot. I don't know how to fly. I did take my first airplane flight when I was 5 in 1961, and I remember it very well, and watched Alan Shepard take off for space also that same year, my 5th birthday, actually. So always an interest in it. I grew up under the flight path for Newark Airport in central New Jersey. But I always wanted to get involved in politics and government. I started when I was 4 years old. My parents took me to see John F. Kennedy campaign for the presidency. And I still remember it. And I remember how interested they were in it and how motivated they were to hear him. And when we talked about it, because I was a nerdy little kid and I would ask questions like this, they talk about, how he can change people's lives and that this is a good thing to do. So I was always interested in politics and government. When I went to college, I majored in government and Soviet studies. My long-term career plan was to be ambassador to the Soviet Union by this time in my life, and that didn't work out. And
I would love to ask you more questions about that at some point. Just what is the whole path towards ambassador? So I'm sorry I interrupted, but that sounds really interesting.
Sure. And aviation was not in the plan, except I like to fly to go places. Took a trip to the Soviet Union when I was in high school and to Greece as well. But anyway, I started working on Capitol Hill. I worked for a senator from Louisiana named Bennett Johnston. Aviation was one of the issues that I covered. It's funny. I got there, and for younger people now, they might not even believe this, but one of the first bills that I worked on was a bill to bail Chrysler out of their financial problems back in 1979. There was a strategic arms limitation treaty, those kind of things to work on back then. Really got energy. Aviation was part of my mission mix, but so were those things.
Okay.
My next job, I was a legislative assistant to then Senator Joe Biden. Got on to better things now. And,
wow. Okay.
And aviation was again part of my issue portfolio. I remember the FAA authorization bill in 1982. How easy that was back then, all the fights they had in committee, and floor vote was just up or down, and it was done. No extensions like they have now, none of that. But even though that was one of my issues, I spent my time on a lot of other things like Social Security reform and tax policy and so forth.
Can I ask you even more in-depth question on that? Like, what is it that you're doing on a daily basis? Are you doing a lot of research? Are you writing papers?
Yes.
Okay.
First thing,
all that.
Papers, memos. I always joke that the skill I developed in Congress or in college that helped me in those jobs on Capitol Hill and in a governor's office that I'll get to in a minute, where we got involved in aviation, was procrastinating on papers and writing the night before. Because, a lot of times you have to crank things out, and 2-page memo on whatever. And, so you have to have the information. You have to spend a lot of time dressing your papers, which helped me, write stuff with short turnaround, right?
Okay.
So anyway, so we did a lot of that on Capitol Hill. And then when there were votes, Senator Biden always liked to have staff who were near the Senate floor to, okay, here's the vote. because there's so many things going on. The senators aren't all on the floor at the same time, right? Quick brief. So you have to learn how to be brief and write briefly and speak briefly, which might surprise some people who know me really well and wonder because I do talk a lot. But anyway, the next job was with a state governor. And I remember when I took the job with him, I thought, well, there goes my interest in foreign policy. There goes my interest in traveling. It's all going to be very domestic. It turned out that he was very, very interested in the broader world. He chaired a committee to promote international education, so got involved in promoting languages and geography and that kind of thing. Worked with the head of National Geographic and former Senator Fulbright, after whom the Fulbright scholarships are named, people like that, and promoting international trade and those kind of things. And he was very interested in aviation. The bill that created the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority, we worked on that. A lot of the work that was done that led to the opening of the Udvar Hazy Museum, that's part of the National Air and Space Museum, was done during his administration. I was very involved in that. And so very, very interested in aviation. And so that sort of piqued my interest more. It was always in my issue portfolio, but this way I could really get my hands dirty and see the result. I can see the improvements at the airports and ultimately the museum. So I went with him to the private sector in 1993 when, I promise I'm not going to go through this chronologically. So, your listeners are listen to 30 more years of this, but this is the main thing. Being in the right place at the right time when you're not even planning for it, right? In 1993, the aviation industry was in trouble. Pan Am, Eastern, Braniff had all gone out of business. McDonnell Douglas was in a bad way. The airline industry was had lost more money than it had made since the Wright brothers flew. Bob Crandall, who was then CEO of American Airlines, said that if he was a Kitty Hawk the day they flew, he would have shot the plane down. And so, it was bad. But President Clinton appointed my former boss, or Governor Belials, who I was working with in the private sector, to chair a commission to look at this. We had 90 days. All of our meetings are on C-SPAN. There's a very anticipated report. And that really sort of was my entrance into the immersive part of my aviation career, where from then on, I was really an aviation person, got involved in the Aero Club of Washington. We had a number of projects. We got involved in international air service agreements and noise reduction standards and so forth. And then, in 2005, as you said before, I was hired to run the Airports Council International North America.
Cool. You kind of transitioned out. So you mentioned quickly, if I just have a moment to ask some questions about what you did, the noise limitations. Mm-hmm. Was that that wasn't some of the beginning of it? Was that just working on noise limitations that were already put in place?
Yeah, at the time there was stage 3 or chapter 3, however you want to say it, late 90s. And a lot of the policymakers and environmental folks and so forth wanted to go to a chapter 4. So the consortium, I guess you call it, of manufacturers and airlines and some others approached us to work with them. Originally, they wanted to try to just keep it at chapter 3, not even have a chapter 4. The more we looked at it, we said, there's going to be chapter 4. Mm-hmm. So how do we make this manageable for everybody, have a good environmental impact, but still have it manageable for the manufacturers, for the airlines and so forth? Because, the airlines had equipment that they had bought that they were planning to use for 30 or 40 years. And you didn't want to do something that rendered half their fleet immediately worthless. That makes no sense.
Right.
So I think we helped come up with a solution, which was a 10 dB reduction went from chapter 3 to chapter 4. Okay. Hush kits were a big issue back then. And there was a lot going on with Europe, and we were very involved in that. And spent a lot of time in Brussels, Strasbourg, London, and also at ICAO headquarters in Montreal on those issues. And at the end of the day, chapter 4 came into being about the same time as the 9/11, attacks happened. Mm-hmm. And obviously the airlines had to sort of resize a little bit after that. And so like the 727s, which were kind of probably the noisier planes at the time, mostly went out of service for more for economic reasons than for environmental reasons.
Okay.
But
how many years do you think that you worked on, let's say, the stage 4? Like, how long did it take to realize you were going to have a stage 4 to where it was actually implemented and mandated?
stage 3 came about only in the early 90s. So, we got hired to work on this in probably 1998 or something like that.
Okay.
And all the work led up to the ICAO assembly, which was in 2001 that year. They have this train every 3 years, they have assembly. And that's where those kinds of things get adopted. And like I said, originally, some of the industry folks are saying, well, gee, we just went from stage 2 to stage 3 already, stage 4.
Yeah.
And, I think the contribution we made was, on the one hand, credibility with the more environmentally minded policymakers and so forth, because of the governor and my, political past, but then also credibility with the industry because of the work we've done in the commission and the Clinton administration. Okay. And so, say we're going to have something, let's make it manageable. And at the end of the day, it happened and it was manageable. And they've gone on to further stricter standards since. And of course, the technology at the time, I remember learning that to make the modifications in an engine to lower the noise, one of the trade-offs was an increase in NOx. So bad emissions, right?
Yep.
And at the time, there wasn't as much talk about emissions as there is now. Mm-hmm. And so, so we'll have this increase or this decrease in the noise. We'll have this other increase. We'll figure it out. But as time has gone on, this is one of the wonderful things about aviation. Without even, without a policymaker mandating it or anything else, the industry, the engine makers and the airline makers, the airframe manufacturers got together and they figured out how to do this. And you don't have that trade-off anymore. And it was one of those things where, they don't always have to have a policymaker or legislator. I mean, this is funny coming from someone who worked for 3 politicians, but tell them what to do. They see what's going on in the market and what needs to happen. And I think that's one of the undertold stories of aviation. And in addition to promoting, more diversity in the workplace, which I think people who look like me need to do, frankly, aviation's going to have a good future. I think doing a better job of telling the story about aviation, making these great changes without necessarily having someone wag their finger and say, you must do this.
That's a great point.
I think it's underappreciated.
I totally agree. I really hadn't thought much about it before, but you're right. Aviation we do tend to give back and go above and beyond in general without having somebody breathing down our necks. Mm-hmm. That's a really great story.
Well, and, the part of aviation you're involved in, NBAA and GAMA are, helping lead the charge, for example, on sustainable aviation fuel. And they've been on this for a few years. And oddly enough, through one of my kids who works in the PR field, I was reached out to a couple of years ago by some folks who work for a very well-known environmental organization, not as far over to the side as Greenpeace, for example.
Okay. Right.
But still a well-known environmental organization. And they wanted to know what they could do to promote sustainable aviation fuel coming into better use. Because they're not one of these people who say you can't fly, you shouldn't fly. They understand people are going to fly. So how do we make it more sustainable?
Yep.
And one of my points to them was that organizations like NBAA and GAMA, you're not going to find a lot of left-wingers in those places. I mean, to be candid, right? But, an environmental organization like the one I spoke with, I said to them, you really need to reach out to those people. Because I think if you get together with them, then, it's a win-win for everybody. You can get interested in on Capitol Hill, in the Biden administration and all that. I actually don't know what happened after that. They didn't call, they were trying to get hired to do this work, and maybe they didn't get hired. I don't know, but for this environmental group. But to me, it's one of those things where you've got the environmental groups really interested in it. You've got aviation leaders already interested in it. Mm-hmm. Let's get everybody together.
Yeah, that's great. More power with more people all on the one side. That's very interesting. Okay. And all of that was before 2005, basically, which is where then you went over to the Airports Council International. So tell me what that was about.
So the Airports Council International North America is the trade association for airports in the U.S. and Canada. Okay. And, it's funny, again, for anybody listening, especially younger, I never planned to go into aviation. I told myself I would never work for an association.
Okay.
And all these other things I told myself I wouldn't do at the time. And I ended up doing almost everything I told myself I wouldn't do. You just don't, you can plan these things out, but then you get an opportunity that comes along. And, and I also tell people, if you're interested in that job, apply for it. The worst thing you can do is tell you no. So when Airports Council International North America, my predecessor left, he retired, and they were looking for either an airport director or an association executive. I was neither. But I was interested in airports from my time in state government, from, the creation of the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority and some other things. We viewed airports and state government as an economic driver, whether they were huge airports like Washington Dulles or small airports. I now live in Augusta County, Virginia, and we have small general aviation airports all around us. And we put money into those too, because they're economic drivers for their area. So I was always interested in it. Not because I was a pilot, not because I had jet fuel in my blood. Neither of my parents, flew very much at all in their lives. But so anyway, I applied for the job. But, that'd be a fun job. And, if I get it, I get it. If I don't, well, I already have a job, so that's good. And I also, when I went into the interview, I was interviewing with the executive committee of this organization, all really good airport directors. And I just said, I'm just going to tell them what I think and what I'm going to do, what I want to do. So I spent a lot of time thinking about it. You asked about researching. I researched the issues and the people involved and everything. And I put together these presentations and answers to questions and so forth. I said, this is what I want to do. Because you don't want to get hired for a job not telling them that anyway.
Sure.
If you tell me what you think they want to hear and then you go do something else, they're going to say, well, what's wrong here?
Sure.
So I just went for it. I had nothing to lose. My kids were just about to graduate high school and go off to college. So there was college tuition to pay and everything else as well. So I got the job and had 8 really good years on the job. And we did a lot of really good things. And I left with the time record membership and the increase in the budget and activity and everything. And they've continued to grow since and do great things in the 10 years since I left.
What a great example of having a passion for your job. And obviously you went into it. I think hands down, anybody doing hiring, unless maybe it's a super technical piece, somebody who's passionate about the job should and does win the invitation to work for that company faster than somebody who maybe just checks off boxes that are on the requirement for the resume.
I was listening to I was at the Harvard Club of Boston or something. We were up there for our ECI conference, and I was standing next to one of the best leaders I've ever been around, Jim Cherry, who's now retired. He was the airport director in Montreal. And we were listening to this professor give a speech about leadership. It was a horrible speech. He just mumbled and kept looking down at the flock sweat. He knew he was not doing well.
Yeah.
And at the end, Jim turned to me and said, well, that was a terrible speech. You know why? And I said, well, where do we even start? He said, he never said the word passion. How can you talk about leadership and not talk about passion?
Yeah, it's true.
It is true. And that comes through. And so, I think I was a temperament hire. So they were looking for a certain set, they're looking for these 3 or 4 or 5 skills or whatever. Right. But I think they hired me because of my temperament and passion, and that they thought that, that's what they needed. Herb Kelleher, the Southwest Airlines founder, legendary figure, always told me, we hire for personality and passion and temperament. We can teach them all the other stuff.
It's so true. In almost any section, we do quite a few hires as well on our side. And that's where we've gotten to as well. Now we have a few skills that we really want to have, basic ones, but then it comes down to attitude. Does your attitude fit with the team? Are you excited to be here? Yeah. So when you wrote that presentation of things that you wanted to do that you thought would be great, is there 1 or 2 things that were top on the list that you ended up getting to do?
Yeah, I think, I wanted ACI North America to be the place where folks who don't know a lot about aviation went to find out about airports.
Okay.
So I put myself, so this is 2005, still within less than 20 years after I left Capitol Hill. So I was I had aviation in my issue list for both senators. It was not a huge priority for either one of them. I didn't spend a lot of time on it, but when the time came, each of those senators had the same vote as the chair of the aviation subcommittee. Each of those senators needed to know what was going on. And so I thought, well, most of the people who make these decisions about this stuff, who vote on it, don't have the basic information. So we want to be the place where they can go get this. When I sort of researched a little bit before the first interview, I found that, for example, the page on airport finance had not been updated in 3 years.
Okay.
And they said, well, come back in June of 2002 to hear the latest. And it was, by this time, it was February of 2005. So, things like that. And I think, that we ended up doing that. And, they've only, gotten better at it since.
That is so cool.
Yeah.
Another example of you being able to work on something that you could actually see come to fruition.
Yeah, it makes a difference. And that's one of the reasons I love state government so much. I mean, with all due respect to the senators who I worked for, who were both very successful and got legislation passed and did a lot of things. When you're working in state government, you're working on things. I mean, to this day, living in Virginia, I was governor of Virginia I worked for. My wife is, she rolls her eyes sometimes at the stories I tell for the 500th time. We worked on that. We worked on that. We worked on that. You can see it. You drive down a road and you know that road was expanded or whatever. Or you go to an airport, either the Washington airports, DCA or Dulles. They're where they are because of work we did. And so, yeah, it's wonderful.
I think I find that fascinating too, because sometimes like I said, you're driving down the road, you might go by an airport and it's just there. And you're just like, well, that was there. And sometimes we forget to think about all of the man hours and time and documentation and all of that went into building that infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
Many, many years, months, and all of the paperwork.
Right. Well, and sometimes the opposition too.
Sure.
The folks in Maryland were opposed to creating the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority. They thought it would hurt BWI. In the end, BWI is thriving. If I would joke with my friends who were running BWI, after I took the ACI job, that, if they had known back then what they know now, nobody would have opposed it. That bill would have passed in about 5 minutes, but it didn't. It was a hard slug.
Sure. Opposition to change. It's new. You're not sure what's going to happen with it. Yeah. So a lot of discussions, I'm sure, back and forth.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So after that, where did you go?
So, my interest in airports, was reignited and everything. And I became an aviation person. And, I after consulting for a short period of time, I took a job as president and CEO of the National Association of State Aviation Officials. And I only did that for 2 years because the NAA job came along and it was too good to pass up. But each state has, an aviation department of one kind or another. In some states, that person reports directly to the governor and he's a friend of the governor's. In other states, the governor doesn't even know that they've got this department, and they kind of varied a little bit. But, they're 50 of the best public servants, I think, around. They really care about improving aviation in their state. They just want to make things happen. They know that they're not, in most cases, they're not looking for any kind of accolades or articles or anything about them. And a lot of their work goes unnoticed, but they're just really, I think, good, solid public servants who love aviation and want their state, to get all the benefit of having airports, working airports, having sometimes manufacturing plants, having, when UAVs started coming along, having the infrastructure and the regulations to allow the expansion of that. And I'm sure now with the urban mobility, vehicles and so forth, eVTOLs and all that, I'm sure that they're in the forefront of that too.
Sure. That makes sense. Interesting. Okay. I guess I didn't, that's another one of those things. I didn't realize all the different levels of personnel and people that it makes that our country needs to keep those things working.
Yeah. And then, the great thing about the National Aeronautic Association is it's been around since 1905. Orville Wright was chair of the Contest and Records Board for a long time. It's an historic organization. It's recognized achievement. it's the record certifier in the U.S. It's not the Guinness Brewing Company. It's the National Aeronautic Association. And they're part of a global group called the International Aeronautic Federation. FAI is the French acronym that does the world records and promotes all of that and air sports as well.
Really?
So parachuting and aerobatic flying and gliding and all these other things, aeromodeling, things you can think of. NAA is involved in all of that. And so, it's been a lot of fun to, as I look back on 44 years, never having aviation even in my, thought process, having been able to work with really across the entire spectrum of aviation, airports and commercial airlines and general aviation. The General Aviation Revitalization Act is something I'm really proud of. That commission I told you about is indispensable in that. And some of us who were Democrats took a lot of beatings from the trial lawyers and others who didn't want that. But, we stood firm along with President Clinton and got it done. But being involved in air sports and not as much military aviation, but still, some. And so, really having this broad exposure in all these different parts of my career to really every end of aviation, even ends that people don't even really think about, has been really, a lot of fun and honor and an unexpected joy.
That is so cool. So, and I'm not trying to date you or anything, but like how many years do you think you've been in aviation or touched aviation, even if you're just working on bills or something that?
Well, from 1979, when I got the first job on Capitol Hill, aviation was always in my issue mix. So it's 44 years, retired and counting really, because I'm doing a little bit of consulting. I'm still very involved in the FAI group, the international group I told you about. And, plan to put myself forward for a leadership position with them in this next year when they have their elections. And so, 44 years and counting, I guess. And it's but immersed, fully immersed in it for the last 30 of those years.
That is so cool. How about what is some of the best or most favorite work that you had from the National Aeronautic Association?
Each year we select the recipient of the Collier Trophy, and Robert Collier established his trophy. It was first awarded in 1911, and it's for the greatest achievement in aeronautics or astronautics in the previous year in actual use. So it's not like a theory. You can't get it for a theory. You have to get it for actually doing something. And so if you look at the history of that award, it's an honor to be. Orville Wright received it the third year.
Sure.
Chuck Yeager received it. The Mercury 7 astronauts received it. Apollo 8, Apollo 11 all received it. And being able to acknowledge that kind of achievement and knowing that an award like that, it not only acknowledges what's happened in the past, but sets a bar for the future and gives incentive for people to do even better. And 2 years ago, we gave it to the team at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory that put the helicopter on Mars.
Okay.
And if your listeners don't know about that, Google it. It's completely fascinating.
I'll Google it. I'll do one better. I'll Google it and I'll put it in the notes underneath here so that people can just click on it.
It's amazing. And I got to, before it went up and everything, I was actually out at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and had a little briefing, and they said they had the propellers on a table, and the propellers are 3 or 4 feet long. And they said, pick one up. And so I picked it up and I was hitting myself in the face with it because it only weighs 2 ounces.
Wow.
I mean, what are you able to do? And then the challenges of flying a helicopter in a place where the atmosphere is only 1% as dense as the Earth atmosphere. Think about that, how hard that is. And they have some great video. And so we gave the Collier Trophy to them 2 years ago. And I remember somebody saying when the vote was time for the vote, if you don't get a Collier for flying a helicopter on Mars, what do you get for?
Right.
So they got it. So I told that story again last year. We gave it to the James Webb Space Telescope.
Okay.
And think about it. That telescope is up there and all that went into it. And there's something like, there were thousands of little parts of this thing that had to unfold 1 million miles in space, 1 million miles away from Earth. And it all had to happen perfectly. And it did. And then it can look so far into the universe that it's almost looking back to the beginning of time. But if you think about it, if a star is 1 million light years away, for example, and that means what you're seeing up there in the sky, in the Milky Way or whatever, is what it looked like 1 million years ago. So this telescope is like a time machine, and it's looking back, and they're estimating now that they're within 250,000 years of the Big Bang. So they're looking at billions of years, and it's an incredible thing. And so, I told that story this past year when we presented the award to them. So being able to be around people who think about these things and can conceive of them, and then actually make them happen, really is an incredible. It's a joy, but it's also an honor to be able to do that. To call attention to that kind of achievement.
That is so cool. So you actually get to talk to these people and kind of pick their brain and.
Yeah, I mean, the extent I could, because I'm not smart enough to have a long conversation.
I feel the same.
And then all of that, and then there's also going to the NBAA conference each year and presenting national world records to Gulfstream and to Embraer and to Bombardier and a number of these other companies that have set records and, done some of that. Cirrus Aircraft, which also won a Collier a few years ago. Gulfstream has 3 of them. But presenting these records, they flew from here to there faster than anybody ever has. And, what you're doing is you're talking to people and honoring people who've done something that hasn't been done before. But you also know that somebody out there is going to beat that. And that's the point. So it's all about how do we get better? And the first, the Wright brothers flew for 12 seconds and whatever, and didn't go very fast. And you've gone from that. I'm 67 years old, and less time than that, they went from that to being on the moon, 66, really 65 and a half years. And then, all the things we just talked about on Mars and everything. So each record that you present, the record setter loves that. And doesn't really want to think about it this way, but then you also hope that you're presenting another record, maybe even to the same people, a year or two down the road for doing even better. And so that's how we get better.
Building on that over and over. And then I think it's kind of cool that you're mentioning names that a lot of us work with in general. So a lot of us work with Embraer aircraft or Gulfstream aircraft. So sort of by association, we get to be parts of these groups that are creating wonderful new advances.
Well, I think that's it. I think that's a huge point. It goes back to what we talked about earlier, maybe before we started, about all the different aspects of aviation, the different jobs. Yeah. Neil Armstrong, who I never was honored to meet, but he used to say that 2 people walked on the moon and another fellow flew them up there, but there were 300,000 people who put them there.
Yes.
And he always said that. And, that's the truth. And so when Gulfstream Aerospace and the NASA administrator and Gulfstream CEO, Kathy Warden, and the NASA administrator, Bill Nelson, came to get the Collier Trophy, they talked about, it's great you're handing us this hardware, right? But there's all these other people, some of whom are in the room, but most of whom are not, who did this.
Very true. And I suppose that's really for almost any accomplishment. It's rarely just one single person. It's the community that you have around you.
Right.
Which kind of talks to a lot of times when we're talking to people on the podcast, the theme is the fact that you really need to network with other people, and not only network so that you can advance yourself going forward, but so that you can, as a team, create something better.
Mm-hmm. You can learn. The smartest person I ever knew, and the best leader I ever worked with, was the governor I worked for, Jerry Beliles. Mm-hmm. He always said, always make sure that you're surrounding yourself with people smarter than you. Yeah. He was the smartest person I ever knew, but his staff, myself not included, but included, it was the best of, the best speechwriter, the best press secretary, the best chief of staff, the this and that. And so the more you network, and spend less time talking about yourself and more time asking questions, you can learn from them. And, so put yourself in the company of smart people, put yourself in the company of people who are doing things you hope to do someday, and talk to them, ask questions of them, learn from them.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. And I think too, I think a lot of people that are in those positions that are creating, they don't mind the questions. Like they don't mind talking to people who are, again, like using the word you were talking about before, passionate. If you're passionate about learning what they're working on, I have a feeling they wouldn't mind speaking with you or emailing with you. You could just contact them.
I made myself a promise when I started trying to find my first job on Capitol Hill.
Okay.
I talked to all kinds of folks. I talked to members of Congress and senators. I also talked to staff, and so many people helped me. And so I made a promise that I would, always be willing to be helpful. If anybody asked me for help, I'd have a cup of coffee with them or talk to them, and do whatever I can to give advice and so forth. And nobody gets to where they are. You didn't get to where you are. I didn't get to where I am all by ourselves.
Nope. Very true. It really does take a village and asking questions. So then I kind of go to my next question. If you were giving some advice, perhaps to either a young person or somebody new to aviation that wanted to transition in, any advice that you have for them?
Yeah, I think, again, it's like we talked about before, it's not just pilots and flight attendants, the people you see. If you go to an airport and look around, there are so many people working there. But my wife likes to use the example. There's a Chick-fil-A at the airport. So you can all these jobs you're there, right?
Sure.
With concessions, whether if you like interior design, go down to Gulfstream or Bombardier, Embraer, any of these other places. They have these beautiful rooms with interiors you can pick out and mix and match, and they have people there to help you. And people have to design this stuff. There are so many career fields. You don't have to. I'm not that good at math or in engineering. I don't really want to learn how to fly a plane, but I'm interested in this aviation thing. There's a place for you. And I mean, frankly, I'm a sports fan, and one of my sports teams is doing poorly. I'll say, well, I wish they can go out and get, there must be somebody out there who can pitch or whatever, somebody who can run with the ball or whatever. Aviation, is experiencing shortages throughout, not just pilots and mechanics and pretty much every job category. And, yet it's going to continue to grow, and we're going to need everybody. This is one of the things I'm passionate about. For those of you listening, I'm your stereotypical 67-year-old white guy, and there are lots of us in aviation, but we're going to need a lot more women, a lot more minorities, and a lot more people with non-traditional backgrounds to be interested in this. And, I
agree.
Plan on spending retirement time trying to promote that. I mean, I think people who do look like me and have benefited from this industry, we need to hear from more of us. So it shouldn't just be the usual voices. It should be for more of us. But there's, aviation's growing. There are lots of opportunities. So almost whatever you're interested in, take a look at aviation. There's probably a place for you.
It's such a good advice. I remember when they used to say aviation, you have to be good at math. You have to finish the math. Now, I personally like math. So I was like, all right, I can do that. I enjoyed math and stuff like that. But what an incorrect requirement. I don't use any math anymore in my day-to-day life. I mean, I might use some stuff, but in general, I don't use any math. So I don't know if they're telling kids that anymore, but I hope not.
Well, I hope not too. And there's a cartoon I saw once about, there was a young girl talking to the guidance counselor, probably a high school student. And it says, there's just a cartoon. And she's talking about aviation. In her mind, she's the captain of the plane. And the counselor, who in this cartoon is a man, he's thinking of her as a flight attendant. So you got to break through all that stuff. And there are roles for everybody out there. And so we got to think, stop thinking traditionally about what men can do, what women could do. Stop thinking traditionally about you need math or whatever. Although for some jobs you do need it. And also start thinking more widely that there's all these jobs, all these possibilities. When I was at ACI, I was always, trying to get the airports to do more and go out to the schools and all that and talk to them. They do, come see. And, they'll have the kids come out and they'll watch planes take off, which is great. But then they don't go back and see, okay, well, you go to an airport, there's all these other things that you can do.
Sure.
So it's a great field to be in. I got into it without any planning at all, kind of by accident.
Yep.
You know, and just general advice for people, whether it's aviation or not. These opportunities pop up just because it wasn't in your plan when you were 20 years old. You know, and I always
your association plan.
I always, yeah, I don't, you know, when I got to Capitol Hill, I didn't want to work for somebody who was as conservative as the senator I worked for. I didn't want to be in an association. There were other things I didn't want to do, but I ended up doing almost everything I said I didn't want to do.
It's funny. That's like the universe saying, oh, you said no, I'm not going to, you don't want to do that here. I'm going to make sure you do every single one.
Well, and, you have to be open to possibilities, and here's an opportunity. Oh, I'll check it out, you know.
Very true. Well, I have one last quick question. You were talking about reading before we started recording, and you are an avid reader. What are you reading these days? What is your favorite?
Well, right now I'm reading a book. I love presidential history. I've read at least one biography of every president. So yeah, even Millard Fillmore and Chester Arthur and Franklin Pierce and people like that. And I'm reading right now a book by Douglas Brinkley, who also wrote a good book about President Kennedy and the space race. But he wrote a book about Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, also Rachel Carson and others who were involved in really the sort of environmental awakening of the 60s and 70s, which led to the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and those kinds of things. Okay. And also some regulations on pesticides and how they could be used, all those sorts of things. And so I love reading about that. I love trying to find out what made these people tick. I love reading about, I've read several books on the civil rights struggles. I'm old enough I remember driving through Newark, New Jersey, which is the town I was born in, when I was like 11 years old, I guess, after the riots there, and seeing what that looked like. And thinking about that, I know a fellow who, in Birmingham in 1963, who Bull Connor's thugs beat up with, nightsticks. And dude, he was in aviation, and I'd known him for years. And I was down in Birmingham, and I went to the museums and stuff. And then I had dinner with him later, and I said, wait a minute, I know how old you are. He's older than me. You down there? And he said, yeah, he got hit with fireballs and hit over the head. And I said, what's it like? He said, well, after you've been hit over the head with a baton a couple of times, you sort of get used to it and you just go with it. These things happened in our lifetime. And so I'm reading a lot about that. And I met a member of the Low Rock Nine. And, again, these things happened in my lifetime.
I found that so interesting. And I guess this happens to every person as we get older and we realize we've experienced a part of history. And then those of us who hadn't maybe experienced some of that, it feels like a lifetime ago. It feels very difficult to almost, I guess, understand it.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend of our youngest. And this kid's a senior in high school now, but this is about a year and a half ago. And he said, wait a minute. Do you remember times when there was segregation?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I grew up in New Jersey, so we didn't have, the water fountains that had the words white and colored over them like they had in some places. But, I lived in a town that was almost entirely white next to a town that was almost entirely black. I mean, it was, so the old real estate rules, the redlining that forced people into different places, we're still there. And stories that have always motivated me about, again, this is something to Google for the listeners, but people like Viola Liuzzo or, Cheney, Shorter, and Goodman, people who got killed, pushing for civil rights in Mississippi and places like that back in the 60s. These people could have stayed at home and not gotten involved, but they went out involved, And so learning about that and, that all those things happened, certainly in my lifetime. And when I was telling this kid who asked me about this, we're talking about this. And when I was working for the governor, one day I was in a room with George Wallace, and it just had kind of a chill up my spine, and I couldn't bring myself to say anything to him. By then, he was, sort of a kind of a sad older man who was in a wheelchair, of course, from his assassination attempt and everything. And
right.
I think he repented on some of the stuff that he did, but still, these are still things that are going on. Yeah. So I like reading about those sorts of things too.
That is fascinating. It really is. And I think it probably also shows patterns do we see patterns in some things that happen throughout generations, I guess? So, yeah, those are fascinating books.
Yeah, and the lessons, are expand beyond, why were people excluded? And why are people excluded now from aviation, for example?
Sure.
If you read the Women in Aviation Advisory Board report that was presented to the FAA in Congress a couple of years ago, and, there's data in there that shows why women, for example, the subject of this report, don't stay, and so
I'll link that report down in the notes as well. I've gone through it. I haven't read all of it, but I've gone through it a little bit. It is also fascinating.
Well, it is. And my wife was actually a member of that commission. And so I was able to follow along with a lot of what was going on at the time. And you read through it and it's data. It's not a bunch of anecdotes. It's
right.
This is what happens. And this is why this percentage leave and so forth. And so I think those things you read about through history sort of inform what's going on now.
Yeah.
Whether it's in aviation or whether it's in society or whatever.
Totally agree. Gosh. Well, Greg, it has been great talking to you. And like we were kind of talking about, if you want to talk to somebody who's in the room that's smarter than you, I'm sure a lot of people would want to reach out to you specifically. If they did want to do that, how would they find you?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn. They're just put Greg Principato in the search engine.
Okay.
I pop up. There is another Greg Principato out there who's like a movie producer or a movie camera person or something. But anyway, I pop up. Yeah, I'm willing to have, people reach out to me by email. So, and you can put that in, in the notes or whatever, but gio.principato@gmail.com, my first initial, my middle initial, and last name at gmail.com. So I'm happy to receive emails or whatever from people.
Wonderful. I'll make sure I put both of those in the notes then on the bottom. So if somebody wants to reach out to you.
Great.
Well, Greg, thank you again so much for your time. It's been just a wonderful talking to you. And I hope you have a great 2024 because we're recording this on the 3rd of January. So just starting 2024.
I know we got a long way to go, but it's off to a good start and I'm very optimistic. And, I really appreciate your having me on.
Awesome. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Please stay tuned for more episodes and check out our website for up-and-coming podcasts. This has been a production of the Business Aviation Collective, sponsored by LD Aviation.